Okay, trustees, we are live. We are recording. Phone lines are open. Go for it.
Hey, I'd like to welcome everybody to the regular meeting of the East Hampton Town Trustees for March 25th, 2024, and I'd like to open with the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Arlene, can you do roll call, please? Thank you.
John Aldrich.
Here.
Francis Bob.
Here.
Cavaletto.
Here.
Chris Dalton. Here. Ben Dollinger.
Here.
Jim Grimes. Celia Josephson. Here. Taylor.
Here.
Just somebody. Jim Garnett.
Here.
Jim, thank you.
Okay, go to public comment, and we're going to first start off with the South Fork Sea Farmers. Jocelyn Garcia.
It's okay.
Welcome, thanks for coming.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Yes, that's good. Are we waiting for the camera?
Good evening. My name is Jocelyn Garcia. I'm a junior in high school and an intern with the South Fork Sea Farmers. Unfortunately, our other intern, Nick, couldn't make it for tonight, so I will be presenting our proposal for the South Fork Sea Farmers' fourth reef, which will be located in 3 Mile Harbor. To reiterate, the South Fork Sea Farmers Organization aims to educate and raise awareness of the importance of marine aquaculture, as well as to inspire constructive action programs. Me and Nick work very closely with the East Hampton Marine Shellfish Hatchery to nurture our oyster spat for our oyster reefs. Why do we use oysters for our reefs? In terms of the reasoning behind using oysters, they are able to create unique, strong reef communities and can mitigate eutrophication by filter feeding, which take excess nutrients out of the water and mitigate harmful algal blooms. They also provide food, habitat, and protection for the marine organisms in our local waters. So far, we have implemented 2 oyster reefs in Accabonac Harbor. The image on the left was our very first reef, constructed 2 years ago. We constructed it in a linear form. The second one was our square oyster reef, which we constructed just this past November in the snow.
That's in a similar area, right?
Yes, they're both within 200 feet of each other. Like I said, both reefs were shaped slightly differently, but they still fit the parameters set by the New York DEC. As far as my research goes and our monitoring with the reefs, Nick and I have been conducting experiments for our research class throughout the year, and we plan to continue research as well as monitoring of the reefs this summer. The image on the left shows possible natural set of oyster spat, and what we did was we placed a bag with empty shell, blank shell with no oyster spat in the first reef 2 years ago, and right there that circle shows a small adolescent oyster, which shows for the possibility of future onset on these oyster reefs. As far as the construction of the oyster bags and the oyster reefs goes, there are no major changes to our methods. besides the location and the updated parameters. We now collect empty shells from restaurants thanks to Mickey's Carting, which transport the shells to us free of cost. We still use the biodegradable cellulose bags as well as the hemp twine to tie the bags together. And these empty bags are filled with shells that don't have any spat. And the location of the reef is determined based on a few guidelines, mainly the presence of a water flow and a solid bottom. This image shows a cross-section of our reef. On the bottom, we have a solid layer of bags with blank shell, absolutely no oyster spat. The top layer, we have a mixture of blank shell with oyster spat, and we have the bottom layer so the top oysters don't suffocate in the sediment. So the location for Reef 4 was chosen for two distance, one for its distance from the inlet and second for the solid bottom. That image on the right shows 3 Mile Harbor, and we went around the whole perimeter of it, and we found that that specific location was the strongest and most suitable to create our next oyster reef. The location will be easily accessible for construction and monitoring, as well as possible field trips by East End schools. We do have support from all adjacent neighbors, including the East Hampton Marina, which is the top left, the 3 Mile Harbor Marina, which is on the bottom, and Paddle Divas, which uses that area. They have all given us a letter of support, which we intend to use for our application, which will be sent to the DEC. This is just a rough draft of our future timeline, but right now we have sent our application, or are in the process of doing so, for Reef 4's approval, which will hopefully, if we do get approval, take place in June of 2025, which will be next year. This year, in June, we plan to construct our 3rd reef in Accabonac Harbor, and eventually next year we will move on to the construction of Reef 4. We plan to construct all future reefs in the beginning of the summer. We constructed this past reef in the fall, and it did not work very well because of the weather and the lack of nutrients for the oysters. To reiterate, East End schools would have a greater opportunity to participate in these field trips and visiting the oyster reefs.
Great.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, thanks. That sounds really good. I was just looking at that overview where you're going to put in 3 Mile, and since that's a pretty, that gets a lot of use in the summer, that launching ramp
Right.
there, and boats maneuvering in. So maybe if you put like a float that kind of warns boaters that there's something right there underneath the water.
Yes, we plan to put buoys on all 4 corners just so it's visible. And then we chose that site because that's furthest. It's a little further out from the dock, but the reason we couldn't move it out more was because of the bottom just wasn't as strong or fit for the reef.
If you're going to market.
But we're going to market with buoys.
How deep does it get? Where the reef's going?
The water, I would say.
The water's very shallow over there.
Yes, so no boaters are.
No, there's not going to be any impact on boating. Yeah, the water's very shallow, and that launching ramp does not get a lot of use except mostly by paddle boards.
It's great to see that you're getting natural set on your reefs in Accabonac. Have you had any chance to understand how quickly the biodegradable mesh is breaking down?
Yes, we did the spawn back in May or April this past summer, and by the time we were able to construct the reef in November, the bags were already degrading. So instead of carrying each bag to construct the reef, we had to put them in larger plastic crates because they were already decomposing. So it was just over that summer, they were already falling apart.
Is the reef maintaining its structure?
It
even
is.
though the bags are failing?
Yes, they tend to grow together, and even as I was collecting my research from this past reef that we constructed 5 months ago, they're already beginning to grow into each other and as a cohesive structure.
So the live oysters are
Yes,
maintaining
they're
the
staying.
structure. Okay, great.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Just come back and let us know how it goes.
We will update you.
Awesome, thank you very much.
Thank you for doing that.
One on the right.
The one, oh, yes, so the picture on the left, like I said, was our first reef that we constructed 2 years ago. And the photo on the right is a current picture of the oysters from that same reef. As you can see, they're growing in clumps and they're growing upwards, which is a good sign of a strong oyster reef.
Thank you. Yeah, great work.
So much. Thank you. Next, we have Dr. Chris Kobler for his annual report.
Francis, I just note that Brian Lyden's online here, and this is more of an administrative thing. I don't know if I want to just quickly address and let him know that we're going to be approving the change of the name on his lease, so he doesn't have to wait around. I'm not sure.
Sure.
Is that all right?
Chris, could you just give us 1 second to address?
Sorry, Chris.
Okay, Brian?
Yes, sir.
Brian Lycott. Hi there.
Hello, Mr. Buck.
Hey, Brian, it's Chris Carrillo here. And we reviewed your paperwork, and we're able to handle this administratively to be able to remove, I'm sorry about the loss of your father, to be able to remove his name off of the lease. So there's really no further action required here tonight unless you had any questions. Otherwise, I'll be drafting that paperwork and we'll be getting that out to you later this week. So there's no other issues there.
Appreciate that very much, Chris. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks, Brian. Appreciate you showing up. Thank you.
Be well, guys. All the best.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Can I just jump in for
Yeah.
a second?
Yeah.
Can I make a motion that we permit the fourth oyster reef, Southwark Sea Farmers fourth oyster reef in Bruno Hampton?
Yeah, were we going to get an do we have an application? We do have it, okay. All right, so you made a motion, second. All in favor?
Aye.
There you go.
And we need to vote on Chris Carrillo.
You said that was.
No, it's administrative.
Okay.
Okay, Chris. All right.
Okay. Very
Okay, well, good evening. Good to see everyone. Pleasure to be here and pleasure to be talking to you about this project, which, as you can see on the screen, this is a 10th year data reporting to the trustees. So, yeah, frankly, I'm excited about that and proud about that and really value the partnership that I have with the town here and the trustees. And yeah, so let's dig into it and see what we found last year. Next slide, please. Okay, well, I think these first few we can roll through. We know how valuable East Hampton waters are. Next slide. Both from recreational point of view, but also from fisheries, finfish, shellfish. Next slide. And, you know, on the one hand, the town of East Hampton is surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean and these very clean and clear waters. And that's what sets up the great productivity of East Hampton waters and East Hampton ecosystems. Next slide. But, you know, I think like all of Long Island, maybe East Hampton's been a little late to the game, but certainly changing land use has had impacts as well. There's certainly plenty of preserved land, but there's also many areas where development has begun to change the character of the watershed, and that can have impacts on water bodies. Next slide. And yeah, so the idea being that whatever's happening on the land eventually will affect what's happening in surface waters. And, that usually is through groundwater flow, sometimes through surface runoff, but, whatever we're not extracting for drinking water ends up in our surface water. So there's a tight coupling between what's happening on land and what's happening in the sea. Next slide. We're living in a time with more people and more more of that land use. Frankly, just more nitrogen loading. We know that in one of my first studies done earlier on, that most of the nitrogen that goes from land to sea comes from on-site septic systems, and that outcome has been affirmed by the Nature Conservancy. It's been affirmed by Suffolk County as well, with fertilizer usually being the second most impactful nutrient. And those things, of course, can affect surface waters. Next slide. This is a map that doesn't just show East Hampton, but shows the entirety of Long Island, and it just represents several months of last year, April through September, and just shows that all of Long Island experiences what we call water quality impairments, either harmful algal blooms or low oxygen conditions. Next slide. And I'll talk a bit about harmful algal blooms, but just so we're all on the same page, phytoplankton are the base of marine food webs. That's why marine ecosystems thrive, but there are certain species, when they grow overly abundant, they can have a negative effect either on the ecosystem or on human health, or in some cases both. Next slide. And that can have trickle-down effects. It's not exclusively harmful algal blooms that are responsible for what happened to the bay scallop fishery, but it's just one of many insults, including things like climate change. Next slide. Another big emphasis of the study is going to be on fecal bacteria. Fecal bacteria are doubly important in coastal waters because they can close shellfishing areas by contaminating shellfish. And they can also create a hazard to humans just via contact and via swimming. And so that's a big part of this study as well. Next slide. The occurrence of fecal bacteria is actually quite different than what happens with regards to nitrogen. Most nitrogen enters surface waters via groundwater flow or streams. It's quite different for fecal bacteria because they tend to get retained in groundwater. So you're looking at different physical transport properties, such as surface runoff, vessel discharge, and things of that nature. Next slide. And again, these two types of bacteria you'll hear about later, fecal coliform bacteria and Enterococcus. There are two types of bacteria. They're really called indicator bacteria. Fecal coliform bacteria are measured by the DEC. That's the standard by which they keep a shellfish bed open or closed, whereas Enterococcus is measured by DOH and also the county health department to decide if bathing beaches should be open or closed. Next slide. And just here as an example, in Accabonac Harbor, you've got waters that are open to shellfishing year-round. You've got areas that are always closed to shellfishing in the red, and areas that are seasonally open in the blue. And these are all based, for example, on the measurement, the DEC's historical measurement of fecal coliform bacteria. Next slide. One thing that our lab does that no other lab I don't think any other lab on Long Island is doing this, and that's using DNA-based approaches to look at the bacteria that are resident in the guts of different organisms, and using those tracers to, when you see fecal bacteria, you can determine where they're coming from. So, if you, without this tool, all you can simply say is, oh, there are high levels of bacteria in the water. That's not good. But with this particular tool, you can actually trace where those bacteria are coming from, and that allows for action to mitigate, potentially action to mitigate those bacteria. Next slide. So for the study, we have multiple objectives here, so I'm going to be recording on general temporal and spatial trends of what I'll call general water quality. I'm going to report to you on marine and freshwater harmful algal blooms. I'm going to report to you on those two types of fecal bacteria. I'm going to talk to you about the sources of those bacteria, and then we also did some sediment surveys that I'll be highlighting with you as well. Next slide. So this study was done last year from May through October. We sampled 24 different locations across the town of East Hampton. In situ, we're measuring general water quality characteristics. The samples are then brought back to my lab in Southampton, where we're making detailed measurements either on the spot or making those measurements later in the season. And we're always trying to, if we're getting quantitative data, whenever possible, we're always comparing that data to either state or federal standards, give you a sense of where things lie, good, bad, or otherwise. Next slide. So these are most, but actually not all of the locations. We're missing a few in here, but you can see where the marine sites are. Those are in the red, and the freshwater sites in the green. I think the two that are missing that we added for this year, they're not in this map, are Swan Pond and Pond Lane Pond in the Lions Head Association community. Next slide. And so here's a full-on listing with those two sites added of the 24 sites that we were sampling. Next slide. And we've never sampled this many sites, so somehow we keep breaking records, but this is more than we've ever done. In 10 years, we always find ways to add things on. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what did we find? Next slide. Okay, well, this is temperature. On the one hand, it doesn't tell you much. I put up a dash line there, 24 degrees Celsius. Seagrass likes the water cooler than that. The mean temperatures are there, which doesn't mean much, but the maximum temperatures are also there. Some observations that I found a little striking is how warm Napeague and Accabonac Harbor were last summer at their maximums. In fact, I even wanted to go back and check this data because intuitively we haven't kind of seen that in the past. But I think if you go to the next slide, usually it's often 3 Mile Harbor, and this is our data logging SON in 3 Mile Harbor because you had a little interruption in service. But it peaked out at 26 or so, whereas Accabonac and Napeague at stations hit 28. So, and that was the peak. So it's either 3 miles flushing a little bit better, the other sites are flushing a little bit worse. But this is sort of bucking a longer term trend in temperature, but I'm confident in the data. And it just shows that those sites, Napeague in particular, is prone to warmer temperatures.
What's the location of those SONs in 3 Mile and Napeague? And Napeague's over on the east side.
Yeah, I mean, you could, if you were to go back, if you want, we can go back and look at the sites, but.
So I can.
Yeah, I think it's there's one. We have one that's closer to the inlet, but one that's in the back in that big bunker. So yeah, you can see those two right there.
How many years have you been taking temperature?
10 years. 10 years. Yeah. So I wouldn't put all my eggs in the 2024 basket. But anyway, to me that was just one striking. Next slide. Okay, these are levels of chlorophyll, which are indicators or a proxy for phytoplankton. This looks like string cheese a little bit, but if you just slowly hit, things are going to pop up. So I think, okay. So what you see here are where we saw some peaks. So, Accabonac Harbor really leading the charge. Again, that's not what we used to see. It used to always be 3 Mile Harbor would be at the top of the list. 3 Mile Harbor was in there, but this year in particular, both Accabonac Harbor and Hog Creek sites had some pretty dense algal blooms. The dash line is at 20 micrograms per liter. Both NOAA and EPA would tell you you don't want to exceed that level because when you do, that usually could lead to a cascade of events where you could have a die-off that could lead to low oxygen in the system. And so you can see we got well above that, during late summer. So everything, below through June, everything pretty much below once you get through into September, but July into August was above that. Next slide. And here are just the numbers on average in the blue, and those peaks in the red. So you can see on average everything was below, but you can also see again those sites in Accabonac Harbor and Hog Creek. And the back of 3 Mile Harbor, 11 and 11A is the head of the harbor. Whereas I think 12 is by Hans Creek on the west side. Next slide. And this is just from a prior study, but just to show that we've shown in the past that the amount of chlorophyll that you see in any given system is typically a function of the amount of nitrogen that that system is receiving. Next slide. Okay, so to look at some of the individual harmful algal blooms that we examined, next slide. The first I'll talk to you about is Alexandrium, which makes saxitoxin in the upper right there. That's a neurotoxin. When that gets into shellfish, it can lead to something called paralytic shellfish poisoning. And actually in 2024, just stepping back and looking regionally, there are actually 5 different areas all across the East End that were closed to shellfishing because the levels of Alexandrium PSP got so high in shellfish. And there are multiple sites in the Peconics, Jockey Creek, Flanders Bay, Meeting House Creek, Terry Creek, Mauritius Bay, Shinnecock Bay, so a lot of areas. Not in East Hampton waters though, thankfully, so next slide. We did have high levels in 3 Mile Harbor on the very first day out there, right? And this is also, things change with time. And so this is like a big change in that we used to see Alexandrium show up in May, and now we thought we were getting out early in early April, and we caught what might have been the end of the bloom, and it was gone thereafter. So now this year we started in March. So it's really, things are changing. Like we all know that with climate change, things are happening earlier, and that's definitely, this is an example of one of those things that are happening earlier. There was I'm going into the details, but about more than a decade ago, there was an event where someone might have been exposed to paralytic shellfish poisoning in Connecticut, and the date was April 4th, and people said, oh, no, that would be impossible, way too early. But, clearly, as things change, it's not the case. Next slide. Okay, another dinoflagellate we look at is dinophysis that makes okadaic acid. This is a gastrointestinal toxin. So, paralytic shellfish poisoning can, be very, very serious. This is usually just gastrointestinal. I'm going into more science, but I'll just leave it at that. Next slide. So we did see dinophysis in 3 Mile Harbor. It built up, as you can see, over time. It peaked in early June. So this usually is, these harmful algal blooms do tend to happen as a succession. So Alexandrium is usually first, dinophysis is usually second. The density here is high, but it's not, we've seen much higher. It can get to the millions. So this is the highest side in East Hampton, but not a level that would be a very serious concern. Next slide. And then the final harmful algal bloom, the marine waters that we looked at, was Coccydium, forms these things called rust tides. This is a picture from the Peconic estuary. You can see it very clearly in the water when it's happening, and very hard to miss under the microscope as well. Next slide. And last year was one of the first years we hardly saw any, but next slide. In 2023, we saw pretty decent levels in multiple systems. These are the maximal densities. They all happen in August. But above 300 cells per milliliter, we have seen negative effects on marine life. Actually, you can kill fish at that level. No fish kills to report from last year, but you can see Accabonac Harbor was an order of magnitude higher than that. And you can see both Napeague and Hog Creek also high. And again, this is a change from prior years. Usually I'm pointing to 3 Mile Harbor as the area that's had the biggest problem. And instead we have Hog Creek and Napeague in there. This might be the highest level we've ever seen in Napeague Harbor. It used to be the site you could reliably say there's nothing happening there. It's clean and clear. And again, that's something that appears to be changing a little bit with time. And then Hog Creek, I don't think we've seen levels that high there before as well. But this is one of those things that does, by year, move around a little bit. And has been, just to add some further information, it's what's called an ichthyotoxic harmful algal bloom, so it can kill fish and has led to death of bivalves as well. Next slide. And then, as part of a study with the Peconic Estuary Program, they've specifically appreciate the work that the trustees do and the partnership. It's all about their program is a partnership, and so that program directed me to do some of a larger study I'm doing the Peconic Estuary, specifically in 3 Mile Harbor. Again, because they value the partnership with the trustees, and this is like coming from Joyce Novak, who directs that program. So we've done some work there. Next slide. And so this is just simply some experiments that we've done where we collect the water from 3 Mile Harbor, and we either do nothing to it. It would be in the red. We'll be in the red momentarily. I'm going to pull back the curtain slowly here. But and then there will be a yellow bar when we added nitrogen, green when we added phosphorus, orange when we added both, and then what is the outcome on the algal community. So next, you click once more, and what you see. Just go back one. It's okay. You'll see, and I put a star on the bars that are significantly higher than the control, and what you see is that in almost all the experiments, save for the very first one, a strong effect from nitrogen, and in some cases nitrogen and phosphorus giving an even greater input. This just sort of demonstrates the role that nitrogen can play in altering the algal community. This is the total amount of algal biomass. Remember, we don't want to get above 20, so if you look at this chart here, you can see all the red bars and the blue bars where we started. The control bars are all below that. But when you add the nitrogen, you can see oftentimes you're going well above that. Next slide.
Dates represent
day of the experiment.
Water.
Correct.
On those dates.
Yeah, and these are about 48-hour assays or something. And then if you just hit once more. So this is looking at some of the individual harmful algal blooms. This is the effect on dinophysis. And in this case, an effect definitely from nitrogen and maybe a co-effect with phosphorus. One more slide there. And then one more. And so in this experiment, not only did we add the nutrients back, but we also set up a treatment where we could remove the nutrients by making the water a little bit cleaner. And you can see it works in reverse as well. You can pull those nutrients out, you can slow the growth of this organism. Next slide. Okay, so now moving on to oxygen. Another thing that we look at, DEC would tell you don't want to have oxygen below 4.8 milligrams per liter. These are daytime measurements, and you can see almost all the measurements here are above that, save for just one that was made in 3 Mile Harbor. But if you go to the next slide, instead of, for decades, people would always say oxygen levels are great. But what we discovered recently is that the oxygen levels vary between day and night, which only makes sense. There's photosynthesis by day and lots of oxygen coming in. So for decades, people would go out during the day, measure oxygen, everything looks fine. But with the advent of data logging devices that you can put out, we've gotten a clearer picture. Next slide. And so what you see here, firstly, these lines look messy, but this is what the oxygen looks like. It can get very high during the day, but it can also get very low at night. And so this is from 3 Mile Harbor, and this pattern is also very typical where when the water's a little bit cooler, the oxygen levels are good, but it's a law of physics. Warmer water holds less oxygen. You can't do anything about that. And then you add the biology of warmer temperatures, and that can lead to lower levels of oxygen. Next slide. Yeah, and so that's the linkage. More nitrogen, more algae, and then eventually lower nitrogen. Next slide. I think you might have to click through. Okay, so here are the nitrogen levels. So we've been measuring total nitrogen in water for the past several years. The Peconic Estuary program, in their original comprehensive management plan, set a standard of 0.4 milligrams per liter to be protective of seagrass. And you can see here, firstly, maximum observations. Almost every site has at least one measurement above that, and on average, I think there are about 5 sites that exceeded that guidance value. And you can see some of the higher sites are at Acabarnic Harbor and in 3 Mile Harbor, particularly on the in the head of the harbor, and also back of Hog Creek. Next slide. And so this is just to show things as a time series, so you can see over time it builds up. And if you contrast these two stations, the ones by the mouth of Hog Creek, the others in the back, and so I think I just have this in as an example of just showing that the water coming in from the Peconic Estuary isn't too high, But once it gets in and is staying in the water body, the nitrogen levels do build up. Next slide. And generally same pattern here. 10 and 10A are by the inlet, lower levels, and then 11 is back in the head of the harbor. 12 is back by Hand Creek. But again, very similar pattern. Low nitrogen water is coming in, but enrichment within the system. Next slide. And again, the same thing. So I think we can move on. Yeah, sorry about that. So something that we did, we've done the last couple of years and did again, in 2023, is we have this autonomous vehicle that has sensors in it that we can pre-program to go out and map water quality within different systems, and it gives a very nice visual of what's happening in each system. Next slide. And well, I think we'll let it go just for a second, just for those of you who haven't seen it, just to see how it goes. But that's essentially what it is and what it's doing. So on one of the pontoons, it has a depth sensor, and the other pontoon, it has a SOM that measures temperature, oxygen, salinity, chlorophyll, etc. Next slide. Okay, so we did this in 3 Mile Harbor, Accabonac Harbor, and Napi. So we'll just walk through these. They give, like I said, a nice clear picture. So you can see here, again, the cooler Peconic. This is in September, this particular survey. So cooler water from the Peconics and the outside, and you can see the warming up of the water in the back of in the head of the harbor. Next slide. And then conversely, the saltier water coming in from the Peconics and the very strong freshwater source. So that's the Soap side, Creek. You can see the very strong freshwater input in the back part of 3 Mile Harbor. Next slide. And that water comes in with high levels of nitrogen. And you can see visually that's where you get the high levels of algae growing, and go out to, like I said, the water coming in from the Peconics is fairly low. So it's the action that's happening within the system that leads to the high chlorophyll. And then next slide. And a little bit higher oxygen. Again, remember, these are daytime measurements, so the oxygen's high during the day. In the back part there, and then that same area would be the lowest area if we did these surveys at night, which presumably we could do, but maybe it's not a good idea. Next slide. Okay, so now for Napi Harbor, we purposely tried to bracket and better understand what's happening with the tide. So we got there early at low tide to understand what that looked like, and then ran it again later under high tide. And so here, what you see is the, and this was in August. So you see, at least on the high tide, I guess. I mean, since it's during the day, I guess the whole thing heated up. But a little bit cooler on the back end there, which might suggest some freshwater input. But on low tide, you can see the warm water maybe being exported out. Next slide. And here's the salinity. So on this, starting with the high tide, that is very clear and obvious. That salty water coming from the Peconic estuary, taking up much of the harbor there. Whereas at low tide, you can see a much stronger, the freshwater signal is stronger, and that saltiest water, just a little bit of it remains. Next slide. Chlorophyll signal, again, kind of similar to some of the past ones, whereas in high tide, the low chlorophyll is being pushed into the main part there, and the only high chlorophyll remains in the back part of the harbor. And then conversely, on low tide, it's higher at the inlet because the higher levels of chlorophyll that had been there are maybe being exported out. Next slide. And then the oxygen levels here, this might be more dominated by day-night cycles. It's higher later in the day under the high tide scenario, and a little bit lower at dawn. Next slide. Okay, and then the last one, Accabonac Harbor. This was done, I think, last, so it's actually early October here. But here's temperature, and you can see in the back part, some of the back parts, the temperature is warmer, and cooler water coming in by the inlet. Next slide. Again, the high salinity water of 29 parts coming in from the Peconics. And again, this, very nicely, you can see the strong freshwater signal in the back parts, particularly in the southern extent. So really showing that that's where the fresh water is coming, and in some cases, probably high levels of nutrients along with that. Next slide. And then the chlorophyll signal, not as clear. These are all fairly low levels. If anything, maybe a little bit higher in the harbor compared to outside. But because the levels are so low, and the algorithm there is forcing differences when there aren't huge differences in natural chlorophyll. And the next slide. And this is for oxygen, and again, lower oxygen where the fresh water is coming in, so I think that's what's probably driving those trends there. But anyway, I think this has been a valuable tool for identifying how things change and are affected by tide, but also retention of the water.
Dr. Gobler, I have a question. So we see the water in Accabonac Harbor, it's sitting at those edges.
Yeah.
And do you have an indication of how long it takes for that water to be completely exchanged?
I not off the top of my head, but I could look and find out.
That would be
I will just say, one thing in general for the whole Peconic estuary, I think it changes a bit of an east-west gradient, but there's not a huge level of tidal exchange relative to other places. I think that full tidal range, I know in the middle of the Peconic, it's only like 3 feet. Whereas, if you go to like New York City or the North Shore of Long Island, it's 6 feet or more. I heard a very famous, not fairly well-known scientist mess up tides last year and said, oh, they're really high in the north and then they get lower in the south. Not correct. There's actually nodal points across the coast. And so we're in the Peconics and on the South Shore as well, it's a nodal point. So it's not as strong a tidal flushing as you'd see in other places. And at 3 feet, it's very, very low. So I believe the Suffolk County Subwatershed Study has estimates of flushing time. And so that's something we could look up there.
Thank you.
Okay, next slide. Okay, and so it's always fun to look at pretty pictures, maybe more so than graphs. And I have some more of those because last year we did we did a sediment survey for the first time ever in 2022. We did 2 additional follow-up surveys last year. One was just at the Accabonac Harbor by the boat launch, and a second was for all of Napeague Harbor. So if we go to the next slide, this is the area we focused on in the boat launch, and it gave a really nice and clear picture, kind of a bullseye structure. And so you're going to see a series of slides that look all about the same, but the metrics are a little bit different. So this is just measuring how deep is the mud. So if you hit sand, the answer is you get a 0. And if there's mud, it's how far in is do you go until you hit sand. And so you can see there's definitely a muddy area that extends out in that sort of center area there. And you can see the 3 stations with the highest levels.
Centimeters?
That is meters. Yeah. So so quite deep. That's getting past 4 feet. So I don't know, and we could go even finer scale next year to find out how fine that is, but definitely, and it all aligns. So if you go to the next slide, so that area is muddy. We also measure something called organic matter, and so muds have more organic matter, and so you can see, with very low organic matter along the shoreline and further away, but those same sites that had thick mud were also very enriched in organic matter. This can also make them a source of nutrients. Next slide. And then this is just what the sediment actually looked like, and you can see 2 sites that we characterize as black mud. So that's probably sulfitic mud, which means it's actually anoxic, and the other ones were characterized as muddy sand. Next slide. And then we did some sieving of the sediments, and we had multiple sieve sizes. But this is just showing what was the finest grain, which tends to be the organic matter and tends to be the muds. And again, those are the stations. These were material. What % of the total sediment was less than 90 microns. That's pretty small. And you can see it's more than half of the material for those muddy sites came up in that category. Next slide. And now Napeague Harbor. So you can see here, I think this is more than 20 locations that we did all across this particular region. So you can see in some of the areas it was more than a meter, and that's, I think, the one's classified as red. If you go to the next slide, I think it's, well, maybe that one was out of order. So now you'll see that all the Napeague. So you can see that far bank is the area that came up with the deepest mud, sandier elsewhere. Next slide. And it lines up with organic matter content, so as it did for the other site. So on the whole, eastern 2/3, this is all fairly low organic matter, so mainly probably sands. But to the west, you see the accumulation of some fine organic matter. Next slide. And again, those are sites also where you look at the general characterization. There is some heterogeneity here, but it's along that side where you see the muds, either the black mud, the sandy mud, or just the regular mud. More towards sand, the western 2/3. Next slide. And the same for those fine grained materials. So in some cases, close to all of it being fine grained, in the same area all the way to the east, that eastern shoreline. Next slide. Okay, so that's what we found for the sediments. Now to get on to some of the fecal bacteria data. Next slide. So before I talk about this, I'll just characterize the season in general, because that's important. I told you that it's often surface runoff that's transporting these fecal bacteria and not groundwater. And so, an average rainfall in a month should be about 4 inches. You can see that we were well below that early on, and then we had some pretty significant events, kind of like the ones that we had this past weekend, and that have been becoming more and more common. The whole Northeast, I don't think I have a slide on it, so I'll just have to say it, we're experiencing more and more of these heavy rainfall events. We're not seeing that much of an uptick in total rain. It's just coming all at once more frequently. And again, I don't have the slide, but I do have a slide about NOAA's recently declared that the 100-year storm is now happening here every 10 years. And if you look at where that changes are happening, again, we're in the center of the bullseye in the Northeast U.S. And I think we've had an increase in the very heavy rainfall of the increase from the middle of the 20th century to about 2012 was about a 70% increase in those rainfall events. So like we had this past weekend, and if you look at some of the events in July and August where you're getting 3 or 4 inches of rain falling all at once. So that can have a big impact. And I think July 19th is that one in July that ends up being significant for some future slides. And temperature-wise, it was a hot July and a warmish August. Okay, next slide. Oh, I have the slide in. Sorry, I already described this, but there it is, 71. I almost had it right. 71% increase in very heavy precipitation in the Northeast. Next slide. And there it is, the other one. There we are, center of the bullseye. I guess I described them right at least. That we're now having a 100-year storm every 10 years or so. And that on the left is not a river, that's just a path, a walking path in Southampton during one of these torrential downpours last summer. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to look at Accabonac Harbor first, and you can see where our stations are for sampling, and they're located in areas that are both open to shellfishing, seasonally closed, and permanently closed, with 6A being permanent and 7B being open. Next slide. And so here are the levels of fecal coliform bacteria, and you look at. I mentioned before July 19th. It comes up. It's clearer later, but that's the highest level here. 6A is closed to shellfishing, and for good reason. Almost all the observations here are above that. The area that's open is usually clean, but we had a couple of exceedances there out of the observations. And then, sort of middling data outside of the 12th of September for site EH5. Next slide. And here's the enterococcus data, which is for swimming, and this is the one that really you can see on July 19th. Almost all the stations were above the swimming standard after that. So again, it just shows you how impactful one very strong rainfall event would be. And in fact, if we didn't sample that day, the data would all look really, really good. But it just should show you how these very strong events can affect water quality, particularly these types of bacteria. Next slide. And then moving to 3 Mile Harbor, where I believe that even though they're close, both 10 and 10A are open, and the other site, 11 and 11A, are closed, and 12 is in a seasonally closed area. Next slide. And here's the fecal coliform bacteria, and again, very good readings towards the inlet, a couple of exceedances on those dates. Again, remember, July 19th and September 12th were both after rainfall events. And then you can see in 3 Mile Harbor, levels get higher. In the very back, they're always almost very, very high. And again, on the 19th, was way over. And site 12, sort of on the cusp, I'd say. Next slide. And then here's the swimming data, and it follows a very similar trend. And again, you can see the peaks on those particular dates, but some other dates of exceedances as well. Next slide. Okay, and then, so this is where now to suss out where it's all coming from, we use these DNA-based markers to try to understand what is the source of the bacteria. Next slide. And this is actually, so this is just one data set for quality control. This is an older data set, just showing the comparison of when we have all the groups and compared to the total enterococcus, just to give us all some faith that they line up. And then the next slide is actually from this year, and this is actually showing two different methods, which, because they're different, they might not necessarily line up. One's looking for fragments of DNA, the other is taking the water and seeing what grows in that water. So they don't always line up necessarily, and therefore there is some spread, but this is a significant correlation. So for me that was good to see. Next slide. Okay, but getting to the actual data, this is where it all is coming from, and the answer is basically the dogs and small mammals are the biggest source, with birds being a secondary source in there, and just a couple of human signals, and very low input from deer. And if we go to the next slide, it's a little bit easier to just see, because this is as percentages. And so what we see again, the majority, almost every site is coming from the dogs and small mammals. Whereas we've got birds coming in second. Generally, when there's a lot of birds, that's almost what you could call like natural sources, because those are resident birds, and so areas near salt marshes, those tend to be higher. And so, for example, the very back of 3 Mile Harbor, that's that's input coming from streams and from birds that might be back there. Low human signal, the biggest being site 10 in East Hampton in 3 Mile Harbor, and that's been a site before. We know there are vessels there. In fact, we instituted 10 versus 10A because, John, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 10, it has the marina and 10A does not. And so, it's not a huge contribution, but it is something we've seen in over the years that, when you're near vessels, you can get a human signal. So there is some vessel discharge that's happening. And that, that comparison worked out quite well in this past year when you compare those two stations. Okay, next slide. All right, and then just to point out, when amongst bacteria in general, just to point out a bacteria that's on my radar, I think hopefully you were aware that last summer, you can see the headline there in the New York Times, and you can see that was in August, and then September 1st, the CDC issued This, you can see Health Alert Network, emergency preparedness and response. This goes out to all medical doctors, hospitals. So you can see what the warning is: severe Vibrio vulnificus infections in the United States associated with warming coastal waters. Right, and so we've never seen Vibrio vulnificus before in the Northeast before. I'm not going to talk a lot about this today, but there was, at this point, probably infamously, a paper in early 2023 that said, "Oh, Vibrio vulnificus may get to New York at the end of the century if we keep warming at the rate we are." And then, 5 months later, it's here. And this is pretty serious. I won't go into much detail. I'll just say it's something serious. It's on my radar. I think if you click once more. On April 3rd, I'm going to be giving my State of the Bays lecture in Southampton. I will be talking more about the data, but I will say that Vibrio vulnificus was in East Hampton waters last summer, in some places and cases at high levels. I'm trying to understand more about this. I'll just, one thing I'll just say, it leads to both skin infections and you can get it through shellfish. So at a minimum, and I looked up, in Florida, they have, maybe 100 cases a year. That's not right. 75 cases a year. But, also maybe like a dozen deaths a year from this also, because it's a lot warmer there. And so the Florida Department of Health says never go in the water with an open wound when the water is warm. I think that's really good advice. And also they say wear shoes, because if you cut your foot and you're in the water, sometimes the water can be sharp, or if you're fishing or something like that. So, but I will talk more about that if people are interested on April 3rd. But yeah. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then the last overall subject here is on the freshwater sites. There's a couple more that aren't circled, but you can see the different locations in Fort Pond, Fresh Pond, Georgia Pond, Hook Pond, and then the two ponds, Swan Lake, Pond Lake. In line said. So next slide. So some of these truly are freshwater ponds. In other cases, they're brackish. And Georgia Pond we know is brackish, of course, because it's open and closed to the ocean. We expect that. You can see Wainscott Pond is always very, very fresh. Hook Pond, actually in some years it can inundate a bit with marine water, but this year was quite fresh. And I'd never sampled Pond Lane and Swan Lane ponds until this study, and so here we can see they do get marine water, not a lot, but just enough. And that fresh pond isn't really a freshwater site. You probably should move it into the other category. Next slide. Okay, so to start with Georgia Pond. Next slide.
Did you not put the study of Fort Pond?
We have it. I don't know why we didn't put it in there, but I think it's really known. It's the mainly freshwater body. So these are the temperatures in Georgia Pond. Note how warm it got, and it was above 30 multiple times, whereas the peak for all the marine sites was at 28, and never got over 26 and 3 miles. So some very high temperatures in Georgia Pond there. This is the buoy that had an unfortunate data collection issue in late season, which is kind of embarrassing, but it is what it is. But it did catch at least those very high temperatures that are, it's pretty warm. I'll say that. Next slide. But we did catch with obviously the opening of the cut that the salinity popped up quite high right after that. That's full ocean salinity at about 30. But then you can also see it close pretty quickly thereafter. Next slide. And the oxygen levels were quite good in Georgia Pond, despite the despite the very high temperatures. I told you when you get high temperatures, you're vulnerable to low oxygen. Very few measurements that are low, and this is in stark contrast to, say, in 2014 and 2015, where we saw blue-green algae blooms, and we saw literally anoxic water, no oxygen. So, once again, a pretty good oxygen year for Georgia Pond. Next slide. And the chlorophyll levels also not too bad. Although interestingly, in the fall, things crept up more. It was more intense when the cut had reclosed compared to before that. Next. Okay, these are the chlorophyll levels for all the sites, and what you can't make out here, firstly you can just, and I'll talk more about the Fort Pond. You can see that enormous number there. What you probably can barely see is there's actually a dashed line that's supposed to be at 8 micrograms per liter, because the EPA would tell you if you have a freshwater body, you don't want more than 8 micrograms per liter of chlorophyll, because it leads to that cascade of events. I described this for marine sites. They set it at 20. You can see we're way above that for almost all these sites. Particularly though, Georgia Pond is sort of above and below depending where you look, but definitely for Fort Pond, Wainscott Pond, Hook Pond this year, and then the Pond Lane and Swan Pond as well. Next slide. And then looking at oxygen levels, these are like during the day measurements. So a few very low levels in Swan Lane and Swan Pond, and also a few low ones for Georgia Pond. Next slide. And then, of course, the thing we really worry about in freshwater is the harmful algal blooms that are specifically blue-green algae. Next slide. Because they can make these toxins, microcystin, anatoxin, which are gastrointestinal and neurotoxins made by different types of cyanobacteria. Next slide. And these are a concern because they can make people sick, but certainly make dogs sick as well. There's been many cases of dog illnesses on Long Island, and we had a dog death in Georgia Pond in 2012 from exposure to blue-green algae as declared by the New York State Department of Health. Next slide. So here are the levels of blue-green algae, both on average and as a maximum for the entire season, excluding Fort Pond, which I think is on the next slide. But actually, if you're just staying the last one, I'm sorry. But you're doing a great job, so I really appreciate it. It's spectacular. So you can see that both, Wainscott Pond well above the DEC would say once you get to 25 micrograms per liter, the water body must be closed for recreational use, and Wainscott Pond always above that. On average, Swan Pond was as well, and you can see some of the peaks for those two systems quite high at more than 20-fold above what that closure limit would be. Next slide. And then this incredible event that happened at Fort Pond, and it's called North and South, but really most of Fort Pond is south. There's a little section that's to the north. So that I would say 95% of it is the South Pond. And I think if you go to the next slide, I guess it's going to come up later. I hope it comes up later. I have somewhere in here. I hope I have an image of that event in Fort Pond. But this is Lionhead Pond, and what you see, Pond Lane Pond in the Lionhead community. And so you see here fairly low levels, and then just one event above that threshold in August. Next slide. Whereas Swan Pond, these are right next to each other. You literally could throw a stone from one to the other, and the exact opposite pattern. And that the Swan Pond had intense blooms early in the season and then cleared up thereafter. And I don't have an explanation for that, except it's important to recognize that every system is its own ecosystem, and there's going to be different drivers. And part of this is probably also different types of blue-green algae in each system. But they couldn't have been more mirror image despite their close proximity. Next slide. And then, here's Fort Pond on a log scale. And so, sort of creeping towards being above the threshold, and then suddenly way above it. And then, it was only 2 weeks it was above it. But that one measurement, is more than two approaching, I can't even do the math on top of my head. All of a sudden, it's getting too late in the day. But many-fold above that 25 microgram per liter. Next slide. And there's that image. And so, this is, I'll just I guess I can just give an opinion, right? This is a disturbing image for me to show, because this is just 2 days after Labor Day. I'm assuming this is what it looked like on Labor Day, and that's not what, the jewel of Montauk should look like anywhere near Labor Day. There's been, if you don't know the history here, I started doing work in Fort Pond because the mighty Montauk triathlon is held there. And, they had events where the water didn't look like this, but it looked greenish. And so there have been years where it had to be moved out of this water body. It was there'd be high levels and then it'd go down and then they would have the event. But clearly Fort Pond needs some help. And I did a study of Fort Pond just to understand the nitrogen loading. And what's really interesting, and this is a sidebar, but I think this is something we all, we'd want to see this water body improve. What's interesting is that that water flows out of Fort Pond underneath the highway to the ocean. And I say that because it's not all that development that you see south of it that's actually contributing to Fort Pond via groundwater flow. I couldn't believe this when I was first told this. I called a meeting with the USGS because I got their report and it just didn't make any sense. But it's the way it works, actually. So this pond flows south to the ocean, groundwater flow, with the blue-green algae thankfully being retained, and flows north to the Peconics. So really, its watershed is to the east and the west. So those are the areas that need to be addressed when it comes to nitrogen loading. And I have, with the concerned citizens of Montauk, I did a very, very careful analysis of this. And so I've been thinking about ways to address the issue here, and hope to, maybe collaborating with you all, think about things that could be done maybe for the next water quality improvement grant round in August.
So there's no culvert or anything?
No, it drains just via groundwater.
So
Yeah.
maybe a culvert would clean it up.
Yeah, it's tricky. They do that, for example, in some places like in Lake Agawam and South Hampton, but then like you've got green water in the ocean and you're creating a hazard there. So it's, thankfully this was ephemeral, but still it's something that, it's never been this bad, but it happens every September.
Am I correct that groundwater flows to the ocean on the south side of the pond and flows to the bay on the north side of the pond?
Yes, yeah, I can show you. I'd be happy to share with you the report that I put together for concerned citizens in Montauk. But frankly, it was mainly me drawing on other studies. So it was the USGS that established that in their with their groundwater models.
Can you tell us a little bit possible solutions?
Well, I think the biggest source are all the homes that are on in the watershed. They're almost all of them just have septic tanks that drain to the groundwater that then drains to the pond. So I think addressing that is the what needs to be done. And I think thinking about any large capacity, and I don't know the watershed that well, but looking for large capacity systems, because then you'd be getting more of a bang for your buck.
I think you're getting all the runoff from like Shepherd's Neck or Shepherd's Neck.
I'd have to. I know those roads, but I'd have to look at the watershed. It's very nicely defined by the USGS. So, next slide. And then lastly, Wainscott Pond. I think lastly, next slide. Which unlike again, each ecosystem's different. This was in bloom literally the entire season. Not a single sample was below that threshold. So from when we started in April to when we ended in, we had someone out there December 20th. So the whole time, and it was worse. The worst month was actually December. And so this is a system that's gotten steadily worse over time. It used to be clean. Then it used to just have a short bloom towards the end of the summer, and then it would clear up. And now it's just it's a go. So it's big year round. We're throughout the sampling season. Next slide. In happy news, the levels of microcystin. I apologize. This should be labeled 2023. There was microcystin always present, but not at ridiculously high levels. So you wouldn't want to drink it, but I don't think you'd drink it anyway. No one's drinking Wainscott Pond, but it actually, according to EPA regs, you could recreate in that water. Although according to DEC, they tell you not to. Next slide.
Why would the levels of the algae be so high?
Because there's different types of algae each year. So we have seen a change in the dominant types. So this is 2021 data, just showing that in this year, the levels were actually much higher. And I think there's even one more slide after this one. This is in 2020 when levels were even higher still. And so John, what I think is what we see, and we actually, whenever that levels are high, we do a microscopic evaluation. We're testing just one type of toxin that's called microcystin, and that's only made by one of this blue-green algae. And so when microcystis is the dominant algae, like it was in 2020, you get very high levels of microcystin. We're seeing other species now dominate. So, happy news, relatively low levels of microcystin, not absent, but low. But we're not testing for things like anatoxin, saxitoxin, some other things that may or may not be there. Next slide. Okay, I'm done. So, so just summing up, we looked at 3 marine HABs in 2023. We had 5 of the 14 sites with, on average, higher than required nitrogen levels, low levels of oxygen in 3 Mile Harbor at night. I showed you that nitrogen can promote algal blooms in 3 Mile Harbor. Those surveys, I find to be quite useful for finding out overall spatial trends on top of the temporal trends. Knot Peak Harbor, mainly we found there very coarse grain sediments, with the exception of that eastern flank and the eastern shore there, which were muddy and fine grained. There were a couple of intense rainfall events in July and September that led to fecal bacterial exceedances in 3 Mile and Accabonac Harbor. Dogs and small mammals were most of those bacteria, with, again, the exception being near vessels, in some cases, high levels of human-derived, or not high levels, measurable levels of human. All the freshwater bodies were over that EPA standard, but it was Wainscott Pond, Swan Pond, Pond Lane Pond, and Fort Pond that had blue-green algae. Wainscott was the most intense, and most sustained, Fort Pond the most intense. Next slide. So I'm done. I really thank you for your support of this project. I enjoy it. I enjoy our collaboration. I learn a lot every year. I thank Friends of Georgia Pond who give additional support for the work that we do in Georgia Pond, and concerned citizens of Montauk are getting the samples from Fort Pond. And then, really hats off to the young men and women in my lab who put a lot of time into data analysis and helping with the data reporting. So, I'm talking to you about it, but there's a lot of people, Jen, Lucas, Ruthie, Craig, and Andrew, put a lot of time into putting this report together. Okay, well, thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Chris.
Sure.
Is there any way that that dogs can be separated out from small mammals?
It might be difficult, but it's probably not, not that I know of, but it's something that we want to look into. It's all based on the microbiome, and it's a matter of, can you find a bacteria that's only in dogs and not in small mammals? And that's been a challenge. But we do look in the literature to see see what goes on. We can only it's a little bit beyond our scope to come up with the new markers, but if someone else comes up with it, certainly we can incorporate it to what we're doing.
I have a similar question. I went on the internet and I looked at some of the assays for the molecular source tracking, and one company makes an assay that can detect deer and elk from other ruminants. Okay. So it lists it that way, because I'm surprised that you didn't detect deer in Accabonac. It's full of deer.
Yeah, but it doesn't come up high numerically. So it just, and that, it could be a function of, Yeah, particularly the small mammal front. Even though you see a lot of deer, amongst those small mammals, there may be for every one. I mean, I don't know, but it may well be that for every one deer you see, there's a dozen little mice or other rodents running around. And similarly for the birds, that even though you see a lot of deer, there's maybe that many more birds.
There's so many deer in there.
Yeah, and so. Yeah, and so we wouldn't want to split the ruminant since
Right.
since we'd be diluting that signal even further.
And I also see fox and raccoons, and some people say they see otters. I haven't seen any, but there's a lot of animals in there.
Yeah.
Chris, have you done a 10-year comparison?
We've done a little bit of that. I did it for Accabonac Harbor for a specific call out last, I think it was last June. I did that early June. But that's something we could do. I think in this, like I said, in my mind, I know the trends just based on recollection. But I think in this coming year that would make sense as a specific objective to pull out all that data. And I think it'd be pretty eye-opening because I do think things are changing a bit between 3 Mile, maybe getting a little cleaner at the head of the harbor, but then conversely, maybe Accabonac and Napeague, getting a little bit warming up and some higher levels of algae that we're seeing.
Do you correlate this data against the population of the town?
I mean, not over time. I did show you that one figure where we took the total nitrogen loading of each system and showed that the more there was, the more algae there were in the water. And that was pretty clear, but we haven't said, we haven't done the 10-year analysis. And I don't know how much things have changed in the last 10 years. Certainly, I don't doubt that there's more people in East Hampton today.
We experienced pretty much after COVID surge. I was just wondering if that could be seen in some of the figures maybe.
Possible. Then also working on top of all this, just to mention, of course, is that, if for example, we've talked about this before, John, if the inlet in Napeague Harbor was getting more constricted and filling in more, you'd have less tidal flushing, and then that could also be yet another factor that could be working in that direction. And in fact, as I think about it, from a temperature point of view, that almost temperatures are increasing there more than elsewhere. You'd almost have to say that's happening. So anyway, that 10-year analysis is probably is due. Yeah. So it's a good idea.
The opposite problem in Fresh Pond. I think when you started these studies, Fresh Pond Inlet was sometimes closed.
Right. Yes, and now it's always open.
Now it's been.
Yeah.
Is that question?
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think I'll just say that, I know I'll be meeting with a subgroup of the trustees and in the coming weeks to talk about plans for 2024, hopefully. And so, everybody's input's welcome.
Try to set something up in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, that would be great.
I thought I heard you say you had some sampling done in March already. Is that?
Yeah, we have for our harmful algal bloom work, we have just a few. Well, with Suffolk County, we have a few sites. So 3 Mile is one site we've already started sampling. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks to you. Thank you.
All right. Next, I have Christine Ganesh. Mark will do you next.
Hi, Chris Ganich from the Litter Action Committee. Tina Plessett and I are the co-chairs of the committee, and thank you for allowing us to talk about our event coming up called, again, No Fling Spring. It's our second time we're putting this forth. We're going from micro pollution to macro pollution, and the good news is we can do something about macro pollution, which is far easier than micro pollution. So No Fling Spring is a way to put focus on the litter problem we have here in East Hampton and to get everyone involved in mitigating that problem. So we start with a number of pickups. Organizations participate, homeowners associations, CACs participate, and we're asking the trustees if you, again, would participate in this event. Last year, you participated by picking up in the Lazy Point area and collaborated with the Lazy Point, I guess, Neighborhood Association in doing such. The events this year will be those, and we also have on May 9th, there is a film called The Story of Plastics that in collaboration CCOM, East Hampton Library, Acabana Protection Committee, and the Litter Committee will be collaborating to screen this film at the East Hampton Library. So you should know about that. It's a very interesting film. And it begins on April 20th and it ends on May 18th. It ends with a no-fling spring fling at the Presbyterian Church in Springs. It's a dance party. And last year it was attended by ages 3 to 90. So all are invited to attend that. So that's it. Thank you very much. Any questions you might have about our No Fling Spring?
What's the date of, you have a date for the cleanups?
The cleanups will be, people are now responding to what date they will choose for the pickups. Right now, we know April 20th, there are 3 pickups occurring on that date. Springs Fireplace Road with all the stakeholders on that road, which include the East Hampton Sag Harbor CAC, Springs CAC, the Litter Committee, Bistrian Materials, Mickey's Karting, and individuals. The Peconic Land Trust will have one somewhere in the Stony Hill area, and CCOM has one, which I don't know the site yet, but they are sponsoring one. But there are many other groups that will be doing the same, participating.
Sounds good, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, Mark Mendelman. 3 Mile Harbor Marina.
Hi, good evening. Mark Mendelman with 3 Mile Harbor Marina. We had 2 permits for 3 Mile Harbor Marina. One was for installation of additional finger piers, and we had that permit. We completed installing 1 finger pier, so I'd like to renew that to have the possibility of installing the remaining 2. So that's 1 permit. The next permit is for the bulkhead at 3 Mile Harbor Marina, replacing some sections that we haven't gotten to, and it will probably be a little while before we get to that as well, but we would still like to renew that permit. That's all. Any questions?
Anybody had a chance to go down and look at that?
Yeah, I looked at it.
John?
I'll make a motion. Can I make a motion that we renew both of these permits?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
Mark, did you
Would you
also?
like them renewed a year, past when they're due, or as of now? I think
A year past when they are due. That would be great. Thanks, John.
Peter. Peter Mendelman, 60 Harborview.
Hi, Peter Mendelman, 60 Harborview. My wife and I applied for a trustee permit, which we received on July 25th of last year to do emergency bulkhead repair, which included raising the bulkhead 12 inches for seawater level rise, and also reclaiming about 40 cubic yards of material that's passed through the bulkhead because it's in quite rough shape. We submitted that to the town as an emergency permit. The ZBA kicked it back and said that small amount of reclamation and dredging is going to require a full NRSP. They told us that in November. We resubmitted, and we're still waiting to get on the ZBA agenda. The permit expires this July. We're hoping to do the work in the fall of this year. We would like to renew the permit exactly the same with the trustees so that we can get the ZBA NRSP and proceed with the work. I'll just mention for some of the trustees who may not have, I think I missed the application the last time, but we are trying to work with Cornell Cooperative Extension to also put in a permeable reactive barrier at the same time. So even though Dr. Gobler's data shows that that area of 3 Mile Harbor is quite low in terms of algal blooms and nitrogen, there's a pretty dense neighborhood that backs up on our property, and the Cornell people feel that a lot of the water flow actually could be almost funneled through the permeable reactive barrier, and whatever we can do to help would be great. And we have received the grant for that, approval from the town. We're just waiting on the ZBA getting on their agenda, and hopefully we'll proceed. We do have the DEC permits as well. We got those within a month.
We looked this project over thoroughly when you brought it up the first time, and we should just renew it.
Yeah, and we'd like to renew it from the same date of approval of July 25th for another year, and hopefully we'll get it done.
I'll make a motion to renew it.
Second. All in favor?
I have one quick public comment.
Sure, Peter.
These are maps of the Suffolk County proposed aquaculture 10-acre lease sites. I'll leave them with you. Needless to say, in the Peconics, which is kind of outside your jurisdiction, but still something you might be interested in, there's a lot of green proposed sites. There were a lot of green proposed sites 10 years ago when the program went through. The red sites are where sites are leased. It's very small number. The yellow sites are ones that they're proposing coming up on this round. There is an April 10th meeting in Riverhead to add seaweed cultivation to aquaculture cultivation. And for any of you that are interested, or anybody out there in the cloud that's interested, it might be worthwhile going. I'll just say that from an East Hampton perspective, there was some pushback on some of the sites off Devon Yacht Club and in front of Napeague. There are no new sites proposed there. There is one existing site in Northwest Harbor where there are 6 sites proposed. And I, would be concerned with the same concern I had previously about surface gear, especially for some of the people who do kite surfing through there. They're all over. And if they hit surface gear on a board, they're going to get broken legs. And what I noticed was that some of the proposed sites, especially up near Greenport, off Bug Light, are right in the channel. And I'm just surprised. So the feedback in terms of navigation has not really gone anywhere. But I'll leave these for you to pass around. That might be worth it.
Thank you.
I think some of those sites up by Bug Light, Peter, might be old grants.
The old grants are shown in red as larger irregular blocks.
Yeah, but sometimes within a grant, there's a lease site because on the grant, you can only grow oysters. And if somebody wants to grow something else, you have to get a lease. So sometimes there's leases, sites placed within the grant. So I'm not sure if that's the case, but I know there's some of those old grants in that area.
Yes. Thank you.
And thanks for bringing up the seaweed thing. It's on the agenda.
Okay, sorry. I didn't realize that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter.
Yes. What does it look like? Yeah, they do.
Anybody else out there wants to address the board?
Any chance we get a motion? Or did we
Bill made a motion.
Yeah.
We approved.
Excellent, carried. Yeah, big like rows of it.
I'm not sure. Who seconded that Bill's motion?
This is
All in favor?
Seconded Bill's motion.
Oh, yes, I did. Great, thank you.
yeah.
Didn't you do that? I think so too.
And just for the record, you have 0 calls on the line. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Power wash. That's where they're selling. So,
All right, move on to old business. An update on trustees' participation in the St. Patrick's Day Parade.
Yeah, we had a great time. It was a little chilly, but we had, Tim was there, Francis, myself, John, and we had 6 members of the middle school surf rider club, the environmental club were there. And we had a good time throwing out bracelets and hundreds of necklaces and candy. And it was good. It was nice to be there, be a part of it. Carnations, handing out to the, yep, so it was good. It was a success. Yeah, we were on the pump out boat being towed, with the trailer and the trustee truck. So we were kind of educating the public about the pump out boat and how we keep our harbors clean, getting rid of waste that way. There's 3 pump out boats. That was one of them. So.
I saw the video. Chris snapped the picture from the. It was very nice.
It's fun. It's good.
It's always fun.
Mm-hmm. All right. Next, we have kayaks, a new rack replacement for Fresh Pond and repair to others.
So there were a couple of repairs necessary. Those have been made, except Fresh Pond. There's some photographs I'd kind of like to show. We have a decision to make here, I think, about what to do about the Fresh Pond racks. There's two parts to a rack. One of the racks has been just fallen over because it seems as though the creek has meandered up near the racks and undermined one set of the rack. You put those up. So that's what it looks like. The decision I think we need to make is, should we move this rack somewhere else? We could either, it might be difficult to move it to a different spot on that side of the creek, because just behind that rack, there's sort of a road that people turn around to, because this is at the end, and they turn around to go back there. So the possibility that and I can't remember why we chose this site for the rack in the first place. It would make a lot more sense if you're just thinking about kayaks to put it on the south side of the creek here. You'd show those other pictures, Allison. You can see what's happening here. The creek is meandering, that bar is formed, it's meandering to the north. And then
that area, that creek is all over the place. I mean, it moves around quite a bit. Moves.
And another reason I wanted to, see this picture is, it looks like this is in need of some maintenance. We have a 10-year.
What about if we swung it around 90 degrees?
Sorry?
You rotated it 90 degrees, put it more stable.
Rotate the rack?
Replace it.
Well, what about putting it on the south side? Can you show that?
Well, I think we did it, John, because that's a very active area with
kind of what I thought. Maybe we did.
And there are times where that creek will actually take out the south side also.
Well, this is looking to the east, and the creek, the cut when we dug it, dug it out. Was that 2-3 years ago? The permit called for it to go straight out along the jetty, and it always meanders to the south, like this, like it's shown. So you can kind of see on the right side of that picture where the spoil was placed from the dig, and it's kind of created a little plateau up there. That would be, I don't know, that's one possibility for putting the rack. I don't know if there's enough, if there would be a conflict with people.
They're using them on the bay, right? So it might as well be closer to the bay anyway.
Well, they're also going into the pond, but
you can't really paddle there too much.
I don't know where they're going. They can go either way, I guess.
Yeah, I guess you can paddle up. Maybe just to the right. In that first photo, it looked like there was some more beach, a bigger shoulder to the right. And then maybe we can move them just to the right a little bit, a little
the far side.
Yeah, that's the shelf.
No, the other, where you could see that it was the old rack.
The first photo? Yeah.
Yeah.
Or just, that's fine too. Yeah, just to the right there, up a little higher maybe. Oh, there's the road that comes.
Well, that roadway is pretty
yeah.
much right there, you know. And then my concern here is if this creek continues to meander the way it's meandering, we're just it's gonna erode away again.
Yeah.
We can reset it.
The side you're mentioning would be better for parking, because the parking's all over there.
Well, it would be better for the kayakers, but then the question is there gonna be a conflict with the
People
kayak
sitting on the
racks
high part of the beach there.
and people using the beach? I mean, we can do it and see if we get complaints, or we could go to public hearing, or I don't know what, how to deal with this exactly.
Do a lot of people use that beach?
A lot of people come there with kids.
Yeah, I've seen children.
I mean, I've been there when there have been a lot of people there, and I mean, it's not wall to wall.
Right. I mean, if you look for a place where you have minimal conflicts, I would think it would be there. I go there sometimes. I see children and families. They come in the parking lot and they seem to leave.
That spot seems the most out of the way. If you could just back it up a little bit,
Yeah.
maybe to the right, I think that spot's pretty good.
Where it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just a little
You can just
deeper
push
to
it
the
back a
right,
little.
and maybe see how that goes.
I'm not sure, you know, the roadway is right there, kind
That's
of.
helpful, John.
Is that the latest one?
This one's the latest here. But you can see the roadway you're talking about.
Yeah. See that little red
Yeah.
dash? That's the rack, basically.
I mean, they're using it for a turnaround area.
Yeah, they turn around, they're coming from Little Alberts.
And it kind of looks like, you know, the roadway kind of goes right along the jetty almost. So I don't know if we moved it into that sandy area to the east there, that wouldn't be, you know, in the roadway or close enough to the roadway that it could be a problem.
Is there still room for cars to get by? Backed it up a little?
I'm not sure. I didn't look at
What I
it that
find
closely.
interesting is that little sand area between the, what would that be?
On the back part of
The
the,
west part. Yeah, right in there. And if you look at both photos, it's pretty secure.
You mean move it to the left, to
That
the
little pocket.
west.
Yeah.
Can you show that picture of the rack that shows, look, yeah, that,
Yeah, I noticed it. That's where I first
behind the
noticed it.
vegetation there?
In between that,
It's in between, yeah.
I could try that, yeah, that might work.
it's out of the way. So accessible.
But if they want to get to just straight to the bay, they have to just kind of drag it out through that way.
Paddle it out the creek.
The one we dredged it last time, it went straight up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, straight out. And that bar is, I mean, that bar should come out. That, I don't know what'll happen there if, you know,
That beach is dramatic, you know, it moves around. That one sandbars.
Yeah, it's amazing how far it'll move overnight sometimes. Yeah.
Well, when do you think that other rack fell over?
I don't know, and probably not that long ago because
Still
I think
there.
it would have gotten swept away.
Should you just put it back where it was and?
Well, I think there's not as much sand there as there was, so I think you'd have the back rack would be very high relative to this rack if we just put it back where it was.
Yeah, that's the other thing, that pocket area, if you, the two overhead comparisons, can you go back to that?
Sure.
The sandbar seems to be pretty steady in that area, you know? You see it on the lower one? Well, that was just taken from Well, it's a year ago,
This was
right?
March 2020.
So that sandbar is right in front of it.
Right. Yeah, the upper part of that creek doesn't meander as much as the part that goes across the beach.
So it's probably, might be a pretty safe place.
Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Fix it in the most appropriate place.
It's not a bulkhead.
No. All right.
Those kayaks wrecks rented out yet?
Yeah.
Still available?
We had they did the lottery last week.
It's all full.
Committee reports, aquaculture. We have salt marsh restoration grant proposals. What is that?
Yeah, I think we mentioned this last meeting, but,
Is this the PEP?
yeah, well, this is Nicole.
Yes, Nicole.
I think, and I don't know if I don't know if we read this by last meeting and I mentioned it, or it's come in since the last meeting, but there were 2 grants applied for the salt marsh restoration work. One was to NOAA for work on Accabonac Marsh, as well as several other marshes on Long Island. And that's a much larger pool of proposals, that grant. Then there was another, our same proposal, Nicole Marr's same proposal from Nicole Marr from the Nature Conservancy, same proposal was put into Conic Estuary only EPA call, and that she heard back from that particular call, and that they actually asked her to. She submitted a pre-proposal. Everybody submitted a pre-proposal to that, and certain pre-proposals were chosen to come back and submit a full proposal. So she heard back from the EPA grant people that they wanted a full proposal from her. So that's a much more likely grant that come through, although they might both come through. So that's the latest information we have from those grants. So we'll be submitting a letter of support to the EPA for the EPA grant to her in the next week or so.
Okay.
We already submitted a letter of support for the NOAA grant proposal.
When we submitted the first letter, did it have the full title on it? The full study title?
I don't think so,
I
but
don't
I'm not
think
sure. It might have, I'm not sure. I can find it, but I'll stumble around in this thing.
Anything else on that?
No, that's it.
Okay. So next we have the Suffolk County Aquaculture Lease Program hearing, considering seaweed culture on shellfish culture lease sites.
Well, Peter pretty much just spilled the beans on that one.
Mm-hmm.
That's, there'll be a public hearing on that in Riverhead at Cornell Cooperative Extension on Griffin Avenue on April 10th at 5 to 7 p.m. So if anybody's interested in hearing about and commenting on the proposal to add seaweed cultivation to the aquaculture leases in the bay, they'll be hearing that. presenting and listening to feedback. April 10th.
Does that mean kelp, John?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I don't think they're specifying, but that's what's being grown or proposed to be grown.
If you have one of those sites, you can have either or, but you don't have to specify which one.
I guess they do them different seasons, though, I mean.
Yeah, that's why.
Yeah, I think it would be in conjunction with shellfish culture. I don't think anybody would want to, well, they might, I don't know.
There are areas up in New England where they're combining them all into one unit.
Yeah, the polyculture there.
Right.
We've had a few people approach us about it, no one's called.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the lease program sponsored about, I think it was 5 different leaseholders in the Bay to experiment, do some pilot experimentation with kelp growing. And they didn't have very much success at any of the sites. Barley's done, from the shellfish hatchery, has done some kelp growing for the last couple of years in town, harbors, some of our harbors. He hasn't had that great a success either. So,
too cold?
Yeah, it's only in the winter.
Yeah.
It gets too hot in the summer to do it.
yeah, it's a crop that gets put in November and harvested in May.
The timing works out because the slack time for the oyster.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's not working.
No,
Well, it's hard to say. It's working in Moriches Bay in very shallow water. Chris Gobler's actually doing a project with the Peconic Estuary Program where he's growing, he's doing a variety of different things in various sites in the Peconics. One of the sites is off Barcelona. He actually just permitted that a couple of meetings ago. One of the things he's trying there is kelp and oysters.
Yeah, kind of feeling around and, trying different sites. It's sort of site specific right now, but, they might find a species or something that does better.
Barley's had trouble with slip gut growing on the kelp and on the strings that he used. Slip gut is it's an algae that kind of grows in the winter and then starts to die off as spring approaches, and it's kind of
sticky and yucky. It's not an attractive sound.
It looks like it sounds. It's kind of gross. It kind of covers everything, and it's kind of had a problem with that covering the algae, the sugar kelp. So.
All right. And lastly, we have request from Keith Grimes Incorporated on behalf of John Herland to renew trustee permit number 6-23 issued to 183 3 Mill Harbor Creek Road, Suffolk County Tax Map number 300-94-1-2.1 for bulkhead replacement.
So I think John and I looked at that, right?
Yeah, we permitted that, and they haven't gotten to the work yet, so they're just
The situation hasn't changed. We know it's not
changed. So I'll make a motion, we renew that permit for a year.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, move on to administrative. Payment of the bills, we have that Hodgson Russ LLP invoice for legal services, $123,310.80. I believe it still needs to be reviewed.
Chris was going to review it. We sort of agreed to pay it after, subject to Chris's review.
Well, we've been a little overwhelmed the past 2 weeks, so.
Table it tonight.
Anyone want to make a motion to table?
I don't think you need a motion.
We don't need a motion.
Just table.
They're not looking for like a check tomorrow either.
No, they're not.
Okay. Minutes from the meeting March 11th. Anybody have a chance to review?
Yes, I do. It's fine. They're good.
I'll make a motion, we accept the minutes.
I second.
All in favor? Aye. And financials ended January 31st, 2024, and February 29th.
I reviewed them, they're good.
Okay, you want to make a motion?
I make a motion to approve.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And we, certificate of deposit renewal ended 0232. Motion to, roll it over.
What is that?
What is it?
Yeah.
It's just, we have various CDs and,
Oh, it's a CD.
yeah, that's
Okay.
maturing, and I think at the moment, it's our benefit to just roll it over.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Definitely.
Aye. Okay, that's what I have. All right, anybody have anything?
Nothing.
No? Motion to close?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, thank you.